The story of Bungie's Marathon is one of the most turbulent and dramatic tales of a video game's development in maybe the entire gaming industry. Rarely do we see such a roller coaster from the inception of an idea to surviving multiple potentially studio-crushing disasters and controversies and managing it to actually make it to shelves despite all of that, but also underperforming so significantly by today that it may have inadvertently caused layoffs not only at Bungie but even elsewhere in the industry as well. Going from its initial showing to the world receiving an astounding 22 million views on the reveal trailer, plus one of the best video game story trailers of all time, to where now the game is struggling to break even more than 10,000 players on Steam. So what exactly happened to this game? This is the story of Marathon, Bungie's biggest disaster. The purpose of this video is to capture the full picture of Marathon, and that means the game from its inception, how it dramatically changed before release, the controversies inside the studio and surrounding the game at large that it survived, and also a clear and experienced look of what we did get from the game, as I have put a very significant amount of time into playing Marathon by this point. And then we're also going to look at the potential future of Marathon and where this game might be going, as the financial pressures and the absolutely insane amounts of money being thrown around on this project simply just don't justify the result and, in my opinion, don't seem sustainable. But I think it's incredibly important to try to consider all of these aspects in their totality. Looking at just Steam charts, for example, is only one small piece of the grander story here. In fact, Marathon is one of the most searched games on the Steam player database, which means that people are, for some reason, quite a bit more interested in watching its performance over time rather than actually playing the game for themselves. But also, you can't just draw conclusions from those numbers alone either without understanding the actual game and the gameplay systems either, because they're two pieces in a puzzle of why something did or didn't work for gamers. And while it's not the be-all end-all for the totality of Marathon, it is a small data point in at least determining the health of the game to some degree, and that is important not only to the community, but to the developers and the shareholders as well, as, this aspect directly affects the economic and financial motivations of the game as well, as the content within it in the future depends completely on the business components being sound and intact. Now, to get some personal bias out of the way really quick, there are two things that I want to mention. First is that I personally have found Marathon's core gameplay and my experience on it by and large pretty enjoyable. I ended up liking the design, the feel, and the flow of the gunplay. I also really like the aesthetic, the art design, the world it's created, the actual lore, behind everything, and it's something that is intriguing to me. But however, I also have some friends in the game industry that I personally suspect were laid off from their jobs under Sony, either directly or indirectly as a result of Marathon's underperformance and Bungie's crazy cash burn. The reason I needed to say that is because if you were expecting a video of someone just trashing on the actual core gameplay and nothing more, that's not what this video is. Or if you were expecting me not to be critical of the financial aspect and to not be a little bit irritated by its handling and the subsequent catastrophes that would ripple into the rest of the industry, then this video isn't for you, because I'm going to go there, both in terms of analyzing the gameplay, systems, and the content, the good, bad, and the ugly, because I have a lot to say on those too, but I'm also going to pull back a little bit and determine if Marathon's continued existence makes fiscal sense or not, and also what that means for the future of Bungie and the future of this game. Let me be clear, there's nothing more that I wanted than to see a Bungie game succeed. As a kid who grew up on both Halo and Destiny, Bungie has always been part of my core gaming identity, and I know I'm not alone in that. And so when Marathon started development in late 2019, it was an exciting moment to behold. I remember hearing some rumors about this game as early as 2021. At the time, the concept of Marathon was quite different to what we see now, and it's also not to be be confused with the 1994 version of Marathon, which I never personally played in its time. I wasn't even born yet, actually, but this new Marathon was not quite the same thing as the original Bungie game from the mid-90s. However, it was built off as a creative departure fork from Destiny. You see, the original creative game director for Marathon was Chris Barrett, a Bungie veteran and longtime gaming industry titan, working extensively both on the original Halo series, but also Destiny as well. Christopher's original ideas for Marathon were far more akin to a PvE-centered game, at least initially. It was first pitched as kind of the next evolution and a further iteration of the Destiny Lost Sectors, a particular dungeon or hidden area where multiple squads can converge on and kill a boss and acquire loot or a hidden treasure chest at the end. But at the same time, the core difference was to add an element of PvP into the mix and make it a little bit more interesting with a living, breathing world. From day one, it wasn't really supposed to be an extraction game per se. That wasn't the core idea being proposed from what we know. In fact, rather than extraction mechanics, it was more focused on like hidden discoveries, secrets, and having multiple layers of depth to peel back and go deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole. In fact, it seems the original point of the gameplay loop was to collect as many of these artifacts as you can find in the world and create them and combine them to make a prime artifact. And it seems you can get that from the world or off other players, but this artifact system is completely gone in the launch version that we have. And I think you can see this reflected in Marathon's marketing. The ARGs clearly have this tone of secret messages, abstract and opaque storytelling, and a sci-fi world that just teases you to dig a little bit deeper. This is a part of the game that I feel is a genuine tragedy it didn't really see its full scope make it in. Imagining a world where it feels like at any moment you could be the one to discover something that nobody else has. That's an aspect of gameplay that I think is really exciting, and this is the exact kind of style of game with its world and its art that would do a service to a game like that. It's reported that this style of gameplay with its secrets and hidden areas just wasn't quite panning out right, and the scope of the project had to change as a result, which means this aspect of Marathon currently is largely gone now. There are some what you might call secrets in some of its gameplay stuff, like particularly the cryo archive vaults, but now really instead all of those secret areas and discovery has largely been replaced by extraction game friction mechanics. In fact, I would say the PvE in Marathon in large part no longer serves as the primary enemy to face or strategize around, but rather the PvE is more or less an alarm system for the real threat in each game, which are of course other runners. Another quite significant difference in core direction is actually the characters. Originally, Christopher saw Marathon as being much more centered around your individual runner, meaning you customize your character from the top down. You tailor your individual character from your looks to your stats, your gear, and so on, in a vein that seems much more similar to Destiny customization, but perhaps even more so because there may not have even been classes or subclasses. This would fundamentally change after Joe Ziegler, the former game director of Valorant, would take over for Marathon at Bungie. Whether you think this was the right choice or not doesn't really matter, but it makes complete sense why he went this way instead, having preset characters with their own designs, abilities, and personalities, because that's precisely what Valorant is. Now, hold on a second, you might be saying, as I just stated that Christopher Barrett was the original game director for a while, and all of a sudden, the former Valorant director is now running the show. And that's because after a few years after Marathon's conception, Christopher Barrett would be moved to executive creative director, and then shortly thereafter was fired after apparently harassing up to 8 female co-workers and employees. This was bad enough. Losing your creative director on any project is bound to have devastating effects, but unfortunately for Bungie, this was only the first of their problems. It's not exactly a secret that Sony can throw money around, and that they also like to make money, and you can see why it would be an attractive pitch for Bungie to tell Sony that they're working on a new, innovative, and unique live service first-person shooter for the market that is supposed to generate revenue for years to come. In fact, it's why Sony was interested in acquiring them initially, because Destiny, especially in its earlier years and even later on, proved that they were capable of making a game that that was broadly appealing and could keep players coming back for more with consistent revenues. And as far as Sony was concerned, Marathon would be an excellent medium to have a big live service game under their umbrella that they could flagship. Well, that was the plan anyways, but things don't always go according to plan. You see, part of Sony's confidence in Bungie was its ability to generate a certain amount of recurring revenue with Destiny. However, in 2023, Destiny's expansion, Lightfall, underperformed so severely, missing revenue targets by as much as 45%, leading to actual layoffs and a restructuring of future plans. For example, Bungie was developing a game codenamed internally Payback. This game was a third-person action game where players could cooperate and team up in a world set in the Destiny universe, a literal spin-off series of Destiny. But instead, now dealing with the massive flop of Lightfall and then even delaying the final shape, D2's final expansion in that saga, the team working on Payback was moved to work on Marathon, while the game itself was cancelled. This means that Marathon, this kind of small incubation project, would quickly become their next golden cow. Pressure to perform grew exponentially because of this. This is the event that I think single-handedly changed Marathon forever, as it was no longer a low-stakes side project and practically overnight became a massive bet for Bungie, but also for Sony. Marathon in the coming months would face huge trouble. Firstly, in the form of an art plagiarism scandal. Shortly before the game was slated to launch in September of 2025, an artist by the name of Anti-Real discovered that Bungie had lifted some of her artwork without permission into the texture decks of the game. It was irrefutable evidence as well, so much so that Bungie also confirmed to everyone that indeed, yes, the art was plagiarized, but also that the particular artist who was responsible for letting it into the game was let go. Also, I think it's worth noting that Bungie did settle this dispute behind closed doors, as Anti-Real has publicly stated that the situation with Bungie has been settled to her satisfaction. And on a personal note, I feel probably almost every single one of the Bungie devs felt like that was the right thing to do by her. It just sucks when there's one bad apple in a team that can sour it for the rest of them, and even the entire project to some degree as well. But the situation did get resolved eventually, but shortly after this, Marathon would do a playtest at their studios with a bunch of YouTubers and streamers. I was not one of them, by the way, but I did have some friends who went, and according to them, they gave Bungie some internal feedback that we never got to see, but also what we did see was a playtest of their first impressions and interactions. But the reception to this content creator playtest ended up feeling just sort of lukewarm. So now, with the art controversy on top of a less than stellar content creator gameplay showcase, Marathon would shock the gaming community by announcing a delay. And normally when this happens, a new date is announced, but Bungie delayed Marathon indefinitely, with no actual release date in sight, and then they just went silent. And by a stroke of fate, maybe something that lit a fire under them again, was that shortly after they went dark, the release of Arc Raiders by Embark Studios would happen, which was a game that proved that an extraction shooter actually does have the capacity for mass appeal, as it could be argued up till now, all extraction games have been way too hardcore for the average gamer, but Embark proved that this is possible, and I'm sure during the time Bungie took notice. But at the same time, Bungie still had things that made its game unique. It had its signature hyper-industrial neon cyber art direction, which for many people was perhaps the most appealing part. Now, if you've played Arc Raiders and Marathon, you know that there's another huge difference, and that is general player behavior, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. Over the next few months, Bungie had private playtests open to the wider gaming community, with a large chunk of a few tens of thousands of players across all platforms to work out technical issues and fix balance adjustments before the full release. But the good news for them was that they finally had a new launch date, March 5th, 2026. It's kind of insane how that worked out, after surviving not only massive studio layoffs and rearrangements, but creative lead changes, an art scandal, a less than stellar content creator showcase, an indefinite cancellation, and a competitor taking the world by storm. Bungie then announced that they were doing a server slam, which the purpose was to stress test the servers as much as possible to work out any last-minute adjustments they need to change before the full release of the game, and they also made it free to play. This test over the weekend resulted in a peak of around 145,000 players on Steam, which is nothing to scoff at, even for something free to play. Over 100,000 players is still very strong, and it was a decent sign for the full launch of Marathon. I should also mention, at some point in Marathon's development, it was originally supposed to be free to play, or at least that was an idea, but then it got moved to being a paid game at $40. Now, here's what confuses me a little bit. I don't mind when a game's paid. Not every single game needs to be free to play, and I also don't mind when a game isn't full standard price, especially when you get far more than your money's worth at the end of the day. But I think Marathon's $40 price tag is a sign of what I alluded to earlier, in that Marathon started as a low-stakes, small-scale project that wasn't meant to be carrying all of this weight for Bungie and Sony, but through a series of bad decisions and the weight of the gaming industry shifting, ended up to where it is now, where Bungie and Sony is now really putting everything on this big bet, and they know that they couldn't charge a full $70 for this game because it simply just doesn't have enough content to justify that. I mean, after all, it is only in extraction mode. If extraction had just been one part of a larger game, similar to how Destiny had various styles of game within itself, I could see them reasonably charging more if the game's scope was bigger, but considering what it was, I think $40 was the maximum they could realistically ask for. The game would finally release on March 5th, 2026, as expected, and on its first day saw the game peak at around 89,000 players on Steam, which again, for a paid game isn't bad, but considering how much Sony invested in this company and the game, it's a massive underperformance. According to the most accurate data we have up to now, Marathon has sold about 1.3 million copies so far to this day, making it around $55 to $60 million in gross revenue, which again isn't something to scoff at and is no small amount of money. But when you consider the alleged budget for Marathon was over $200 million, and I've heard internal reports from people I trust that it may have been north of $350 million when you account for marketing and everything else, that's an unbelievable amount of money to need to produce this game, and even crazier to only make a fraction of that back. And weirdly enough, Marathon really hasn't been that popular outside of North America from what it seems, but it is still somehow one of the best-selling games in the US this year right now, and that might say a lot more about the health of the current-day gaming industry more than it says about Marathon. Either way, who's directly eating that loss? Well, that's Sony. This is the reason why people have been so quick to draw comparisons to Concord, Sony's actual greatest gaming failure in history. And while I don't think it's necessarily fair or accurate to lump Marathon in with Concord, when you look at the data we have, it's at least reasonable to assume that Sony looks at Marathon as a loss. Bungie was burning through cash making this game, but at some point, Sony expected a return on that. And as of May 2026, a mere few months after its launch, Marathon is barely able to crack 10 to 15k concurrent daily players anymore. Now, unlike a lot of Twitter grifters who post Steam charts every single day like it's a full-time job, I've actually played this game quite a bit, and I'm very familiar with it as a video game. But I wanted to start with the history of the project and some of the financials to give you more of an understanding of things before I talk about the core gameplay and some of the achievements and some of the issues, because I also have quite a bit to say in this matter. Other than this one, I've made 2 other videos discussing Marathon's gameplay, my initial impressions of it, as well as my take after 100 hours of playtime. And since then, I've continued playing somewhat regularly, and my opinion has evolved and shifted even more. I assume if you're watching this video, then you know how Marathon's core gameplay loop works on a basic level. It's very simple. You load into an area, you get lots of gear from the world or from other runners, and you need to extract successfully to keep said gear, which which can then be used in future runs. But what's been interesting is that over time, player behavior has changed, and the way that they interact with the world has changed. The fact that it even is an extraction shooter anymore. It may not even play like the same genre like it did even a few months ago. You see, when the game dropped, player behavior was still interested in PvP. I mean, this is probably the least friendly extraction shooter there is. It's kill on sight for like 99% of players, which isn't even a bad thing necessarily, but at least in the beginning, players were also concerned about getting out with certain loot, maybe raw materials for contract completions to level up their factions, and so on. To some extent, you played Marathon like an extraction game, which is good because, you know, that's what it is. However, in the recent weeks, as the player base has dropped and the game has cannibalized itself to where now only the hardcore of the hardcore are still actively playing, this means that these people have pretty much everything they need and all of their progression is completed, so teams run around playing it like it's a battle royale, just full-on aggression playing with the sole purpose of killing other squads, entirely ignoring the world loot for the most part. In fact, what's hilarious is that Bungie has implemented several experimental modes into Marathon, one of them being a duos mode, which is actually pretty good in my opinion, but most interestingly, a free kit only mode. Now, this playlist is exactly what it says on the box. Players can only load in with a free kit and minimal gear so that everyone's on the same playing field. And in a strange turn of events, the free kit mode is actually one of Marathon's most popular modes ever, which is comical because it's the mode that plays most like a BR and the least like a proper extraction game, because the gear potential upside is not even that good in this mode, but it maximizes fair and equal PvP fights. And this reinforces what I've always felt, that Bungie is great at making incredible feeling shooter games and always has been, and Marathon's no exception to that. But I think the extraction itself has actually been their own biggest roadblock. And we even know for a fact that Marathon wasn't even an extraction game necessarily when it was first being conceived. Now, you might be asking yourself, if you haven't really played much Marathon or even at all, what's the end goal of just getting more loot? Well, the end game, supposedly, was Cryo Archive, an area aboard the Marathon ship with an extremely challenging and intricate layout and flow, considering that you also have to face down heavily geared squads. All the gear that you've spent this time stockpiling from Perimeter, Dire Marsh, and Outpost was supposed to be utilized in Cryo Archive, as this was the place to bring everything. There are all of these secret vaults that you can do that require, an extreme amount of luck, but also grinding and getting these keys and, getting access to really unique gear, and that's fun, but after doing all of these vaults, which requires an unemployed level of grinding to be able to access, getting into this boss fight, you face the Compiler, and defeating him gives you some of the most insane gear and weapons across the entire game, and it's a very good fight. Cryo Archive is an excellent map as well, as I've stated. However, in recent weeks, things have changed. Everything from player behavior to new metas being discovered and optimization routes have made Cryo Archive one of the sweatiest and uninviting gaming experiences in recent weeks. There is a minimum gear anti-value that you have to bring in to play Cryo, and for a while this came down to bringing in and spamming waster shotguns and throwing bubble shields at every single gunfight, and then they sort of nerfed that strategy, and from there it evolved into War of Attrition grenade spam fights at every single hallway. It seems almost every single weekend there's a new and abusable meta to play in Cryo that you pretty much have to conform to, or else you're going to get smoked. Now look, I realize that Marathon's appeal, and specifically Cryo Archive, is the exact same psychology as gambling.
Being good at Marathon is like playing poker with guns.
I mean, that should come as a shock or a surprise to no one, but that's ultimately what it is. Every run, every kill you get, you could hit the jackpot, but sometimes you are someone else's jackpot. You don't get attached to your gear because you won't keep it for very long. Yet there's always that possibility that you're going to hit an insane score on your next run or even your next kill. Marathon's gameplay works on precisely the same psychological systems as gambling does, and I'm not even criticizing that. It's just that's what it is and where a lot of the highs of this game come from. But when done too much, this causes a fatigue. The general fatigue and lobbies becoming increasingly more competitive has caused players to slowly dwindle as well. Since Cryo Archive is only available on weekends, each and every time it comes around, it has a small burst of players followed by another decline. Now, this is normal for games and isn't a Marathon exclusive problem, but nonetheless, it's leading to the state that the game is in. It's gotten to the point where the really dedicated players have full stacked gold vaults of gear and all player upgrades available acquired in their factions, which is not going to bring in new players anytime soon. Bungie, at the end of each season, plans to wipe the game and reset everyone's progress, including loot, loadout, and faction upgrades. This is literally the only way they can keep the game economy and player power creep from spiraling out of control. But at the same time, you could argue that Marathon is a game that does not respect the player's time. It can be pretty much a full-time job to make progress in, or at least it was in this first season. And when they wipe the game, that doesn't take away the fact that players already know how to play the maps and kind of what to do. This means that those hardcore players are going to end up exactly where they were before, but even faster this time. Now, I'm sure that there will be some new content updates, whether it be a new runner, a new map, or a whole new endgame area that will warrant a temporary surge in the player base. But I think one of the biggest turnoffs for some folks is the FOMO tactics that Bungie uses with this game, the same tactics they used in D2. This kind of player retention first mentality, I think, does a real disservice to a potentially outstanding and very unique game. I've said it before and I'll reiterate it here. I like Marathon. I enjoy playing this game quite a lot. From the perspective of the core gameplay, the sci-fi world, the lore, the art is risky and polarizing as a lot of great art is. The foundations of the core PvP gunplay clearly show expertise from prior Bungie projects, and it is objectively the most popular way to play the game from the data. I don't talk about Marathon's struggle triumphantly. I'm not sitting here celebrating the fact that it's having all of these struggles and roadblocks to overcome. I wish it was a game that was doing better than it is, but ultimately it's one that I also don't see myself playing for very much longer, especially when they wipe the game. That will be my moment to put it down. At the time of me writing this, Bungie confidently stated that they have years of story content planned or are working on those plans for Marathon right now. Outwardly, they seem to be saying that they're extremely confident Marathon is sticking around for the long haul and servers aren't going offline anytime soon, which could be the case. I just don't see how all of that is going to be possible without some kind of revolution for this game. And I'm not a Bungie dev, nor am I a Sony executive, so I have no idea if Marathon is going to be closing its doors anytime in the distant future. Some have speculated that Marathon is going to go free to play. However, I'm not sure this will happen, and I'm also not entirely convinced it would do what it needs for the game to thrive. This is to say that despite me personally liking much of Marathon, and I have gotten a lot of enjoyment out of it, I also feel passionate enough to talk about it because I think a lot of us care. This is one of the most polarizing games to have to talk about on the internet. Whether you love it or hate it, it's at least generating an emotion inside you that's not apathy. It's possible Marathon could improve and completely turn the ship around like we've seen with the likes of, games like Rainbow Six Siege or No Man's Sky. But Marathon has a unique set of problems to deal with that if we're going to see any major corrections, they really have to address those. It's not even a game I want to shut down, nor anyone to lose their jobs or any of this hard work to go to waste. But at the end of the day, all of the passion in the world won't keep the game alive if the financials and economics don't make sense to sustain it as well. I would imagine Sony is watching this very closely, as this is one of their more expensive projects in recent years. And even though it didn't completely bomb like a Concord or even Highguard, something definitely needs to change. And for their sake, the sake of the game, and one that I like playing, I hope something does change. But as fired up as we get about Marathon and as passionate as we feel, at the end of the day, it is just a video game after all.